Today I turn to culture. I've talked about the emerging differences between the North and the South in the 19th century as political phenomena, associated with westward expansion and the admission of new states. I've talked about the overview of American 19th century history and how the Constitution, by creating a national market, allowed each region to specialize, with the North industrializing and the South committing to commodity agriculture on plantations using slave labor. As Americans moved into the West, they carried sectional identities with them. So today I want to turn to culture and how these economic divisions began to express themselves in cultural differences between Americans from the two regions. We begin to see in this period the emergence of a rationale for a slave economy, one we call pro-slavery ideology. The antebellum white Southerners defended their institution and their economy in a cultural product, a set of beliefs that slavery was a positive good, not only for themselves, but for the country as a whole, and for the slaves themselves. The pro-slavery ideology is associated most closely with a man named George Fitzhugh, who lived 1806 to 1881. He was a political theorist, and in 1854 he published a book called Sociology for the South, or The Failure of Free Society. This was an indictment of the free labor system, and a claim that the South had a superior way of organizing society. I've talked a little bit about this since the start of the class, so remember that here I'm quoting Fitzhugh, who may sound a bit offensive to our more modern sensibilities. Fitzhugh believed that, quote, the Negro is but a grown-up child who needed protection from the market that masters provided. In a capitalist, industrialist society, Fitzhugh and pro-slavery thinkers believed, free black people would be, quote, far outstripped or outwitted in the chase of free competition. So, slavery was a positive good for the slave as well as for the master, a civilizing influence on both. In this ideology, the slave's association with the masters would civilize them. For the master, the requirements of slavery was part of his paternalist obligation. The belief had considerable support from the Christian religion, which posited a great chain of being, a belief that there are hierarchies among people, and that these are reflections of God's plan for man. This is the sort of imagery they used to show the natural order of things, which took a range of forms, but was understood by most Christians as part of God's plan, the natural order of things. In these schemes, the whole world functions like a family. God is at the top, and humans are below that, and beasts are even further below that. Likewise, the family was assumed to reflect this structure, father at the top, women and children below that. This can be somewhat hard to see because its vestiges are still with us today. It can be hard to understand the great chain of being or the paternalistic structure of the family and household as historical phenomena when we're still living with them today. But the important thing to recognize is how this ideology played out in the pro-slavery ideology. God at the top, the father and husband below that, women and children even further below that, and under the care of the father, the pater, paternalism. You can imagine that this religious conception of the social order offered a lot of help to those who wanted to believe that it was natural that the father was a master and should be in charge of his household, including slaves. If Fitzhugh believed that the Negro is but a grown-up child, then it was perfectly natural that he should be under the care of a father. Paternalism and the great chain of being made it seem natural that a master should control the people in his charge and that they benefited from his care. And he, too, benefited from being a master. He was more like God. So, the pro-slavery ideology relied on religious iconography to understand the natural order of things in the views of people living at the time. As the title of Fitzhugh's book demonstrates, the pro-slavery ideology resented what it called a free society. In his next book, Fitzhugh took the point even further, published in 1857, that's 3 years before the coming of the Civil War. Cannibals all, or slaves without masters, continued his arguments against a free labor system that was developing in the North. He developed the term wage slavery to discuss what he considered to be an unnatural system, where people worked for wages and got no other care from their bosses. He undertook, quote, to treat the subjects of liberty and slavery in a more rigidly analytical manner, and charted classical and historical accounts of slavery, including an interpretation of the Bible, to identify the beneficial history of the institution. He talked about how capitalism and its reliance on free labor meant oppression for workers. He talked about the French Revolution, about various gypsy peoples, and the Irish peasantry as groups oppressed under capitalism, along with the factory workers in the British Industrial Revolution, to demonstrate that the Southern institution of slavery, modeled after a pre-capitalist feudal society, was kinder and more organic. This is one reason I began this class with reference to the world of agriculture and social stratification before Columbus. Because during a period of rapid economic growth like the 19th century, more traditional society was a cultural reference understood by our historical actors and used by them to analyze the changes they lived through. Fitzhugh defended slavery in terms of the old feudal society and its web of obligations. He argued that capitalism, as practiced in Europe and the North, produces a form of moral cannibalism in which mutual resentment and exploitation grew wild, and that rich got richer while poor people got poorer. According to Fitzhugh, the Southern plantation was more humane than that. Paternalism meant that the master worked for his slaves, just as his slaves worked for him. And the slaves were happy, receiving the care of their master. In Fitzhugh's rendering, Southern slaves, unlike those miserable participants in free labor's white slave trade, enjoyed those comforts and necessities granted them under a mutually beneficial, supportive system and community. I've seen the records, the diaries and letters written by Southerners in this period talking about their society and defending it when they encountered Northerners during their vacations, for example. They really bought into the vision of the plantation as a pre-capitalist haven and the industrial capitalist system as dirty and exploitative, damaging to workers, and creating a class of poor, dependent, helpless wage workers. There are also remnants of this ideology persisting today, when people defend the plantation past as a world of happy slaves and benevolent masters. I understand that people whose ancestors participated in the system may be sensitive to criticism, may latch on to accounts of happy slaves who loved their masters. But it is still an ideology that masks a brutal oppression, in which your children were for sale, and you were helpless to resist whatever the master wanted to do to you. People got help in believing this ideology because industrialization was a dirty and exploitative process. And in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the industrial system of the North also began to change. As westward expansion freed up land and gave new opportunities to the farm families who had once sent their daughters into the mills, the workers in New England textile factories, generally, were more immigrants, especially Irish immigrants. A trickle of Irish immigrants to the U.S. became a flood after the potato blight killed most of what the Irish peasants ate. And there was a horrible fear in the country that they would change America. Here you can see a satirical cartoon demonstrating that every state was being overrun by Irish, and even the names of the states were changing. The Irish built the canals and the railroads and built some of the northern cities. They worked the docks and did any job they could. They were servants in northern homes, and they were generally considered degraded and inferior, the equivalent of black slaves. There was even scientific support offered for these beliefs in the form of racial profiling. Here you can see the racial designations of the superior Anglo-Teutonic head shape compared to the Negro on the right. with a different shaped head, nose, and jawline. And here on the left is the Irish Iberian, considered to be a blend between the two. The description below reads, "The Iberians are believed to have been originally an African race, with skulls of the low prognathous type, who mixed with the Irish, producing the lower classes of Irish people who were then immigrating in large numbers to the United States. They were practically black. How the Irish became white is one of the most interesting stories in American history, and in our period, they were the equivalent of African American slaves and dangerous to the white Anglo-Teutonic identity of the United States." Here's a picture demonstrating the fear of the Irish. You can see that it's a representation of St. Patrick's Day. And these Irishmen, drawn as if they're monkeys, with bottles of whiskey in their pocket, are beating policemen and causing general mayhem. "The day we celebrate with rum and blood," says the caption of the cartoon. And here's another cartoon showing exactly why the immigrants were so reviled in the 19th century. First, they smell. Here's Uncle Sam holding his nose. This guy's barefoot, and he's got a barrel of whiskey on his back, labeled as Sabbath desecration. He also carries bags of poverty and disease, and a bomb labeled anarchy. Generally a bad hombre. The anti-immigrant sentiment in American culture often rises during periods of rapid and revolutionary economic change, and the 19th century wasn't that much different from our own, blaming immigrants for our economic difficulties, then and now. It was fears like these that motivated the pro-slavery ideology. But the North was changing too, under the influence of westward expansion, because as the New Englanders and mid-Atlantic people moved into the West, they took their settlement patterns with them. They moved in cities, in other words, as well as farms and industry. We've learned some things about the transportation revolution and the Erie Canal, and along the canals, towns sprang up, with industries and shops and links to larger places. Here's an image of one of the cities along the Erie Canal, linked to the settlers of the West and the port of New York City, able to make goods and sell them to the wage workers and farm workers in the emerging western states around the Great Lakes. Places in the North were just better connected than were the isolated pre-capitalist plantations of the South. Wage labor and markets for farm goods gave people jobs and money, and with this, we see the emergence of the middle class. The industrial society was one in which social class emerged strongly. It was hierarchical, as the South was, but it allowed more social mobility. In the South, there are slaves and there are masters. White people without slaves generally farmed for themselves or worked on plantations. They did not live in cities and work for wages. Because Northerners did, they bought food rather than made their own. They bought clothes rather than make their own. And we see the emergence of middle-class identity in the urban North is partly a matter of shopping. Shopping matters. It's not only buying stuff and thereby creating a demand for the goods made in factories, it's also a way we express our identity through the things we own and wear and use. Shopping is about consumption and behavior, and it's a crucial component of middle-class identity. As women left factories and men took jobs, work became something that was done outside the home. On the plantation, the household was a site of production, as it had been in medieval Europe. With industrialization in the North, the home became a site of consumption. And the evolution of the workplace, in the factories, meant that work became something men did, outside the home, and the home became the preserve of women, creating a cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood, also sometimes called separate spheres for men and women. It became the job of the middle-class Northern woman to provide a home for her husband, a relief from his work life, and a place to raise up her children. It was her job to teach her children virtue, how to be good people and good citizens, and to teach them manners. Just like the pro-slavery ideology of the Southerners, with their great chain of being, it can be hard to see this as an ideology that belongs to a specific time and place, because we still live in the remnants of it. The vestiges of this are still with us. Ask any young mother whether people tell her what to do and judge her for her choices as a mother, and you can see that refining manners and teaching virtues, reproducing social norms, is still part of what women are expected to do. Women sewed, and needlework was a big part of what they did. Here's a sampler that reflects this idea. And here's a woman teaching her daughter to read. But while the cult of domesticity, or the separate spheres for men and women, was an ideology, it was also a reflection of economic reality. Women were having fewer children. In 1800, the average American woman would give birth to about 7 children during her lifetime. By 1900, the number of children for each woman had dropped to about 4. This is an average that accounts for both Northern and Southern demography. And both black and white, it's an average, a birth rate that dropped nearly in half. This is characteristic of an industrial society. Children on a farm are a contribution to the household income. They work the farm, which is part of the home. They contribute. In an industrial society, children are a drain. They cost money. They don't make money. And people wanted to spend their money on school and stuff for their kids, for their homes, to express their identity. We don't know exactly how they did it. Birth control was available, but there were no new innovations in that direction. We think that women probably began speaking more openly about sex and about what they wanted, and families got better at making decisions together. For more details, take a class in women's history. It's a very interesting story. But the upshot is that antebellum Americans had fewer children and devoted more resources to them, part of the industrial experience of the northern states, and something that they carried with them into the West. American white middle-class northerners followed patterns of the rest of the world's industrial middle classes. In their homes, we begin to see rooms devoted just to sitting around. Then as now, shopping was an important part of identity. Having the right stuff on the walls indicated to visitors that they shared taste and class identity. New ladies' magazines, as they were called, spread the word and the message. This is a famous 19th century American publication, Godey's Ladies' Book, a full-color magazine of fashion and trends. Magazines like these told women what to wear, and how to decorate their homes, how to dress, how to wear the latest fashions, down to the embroidery on their underclothes. This is all very familiar. We judge each other's identities based on how we present ourselves. You can see me here, dressing like a professor, against the backdrop of my home office. If I were wearing stiletto heels and a cocktail dress, I'd be presenting another identity. Or wearing shorts and Uggs. What we wear sends signals that other people have been taught to interpret. And this is one reason why shopping is so closely linked to identity in a class-based industrial society. But these 19th century Americans also differed from us. For example, their children regularly died in the days before penicillin, and their ornamentation reflects this reality. They often wore jewelry made of human hair from beloved dead relatives. Here's a bracelet with a lock of hair in it. And in fact, today I'm wearing a necklace that was once a watch fob, and its chain part is made of human hair. You can buy these things on eBay. They were all over the place in the 19th century. Buying stuff for their husbands also demonstrated that they were executing the proper care of the man in the household. Here's a popular line of canes for men to carry, made out of a natural rubber called gutta percha. You can see that the decorative parts where the man would put his hand to carry the cane were just as much a matter of identity as practicality. All this is part of the industrial middle-class identity we see emerging in the North. as the North and South develop really different cultures from one another, as well as different economies. Women in the 19th century used this cult of domesticity to extend their power outside the home. It was their responsibility to spread virtue to their children and to make their homes a haven for the working husband to come home to, and they began to apply this power outside the confines of their own living rooms. It's contradictory, maybe, but history is that way. We see the rise of the women's rights movement as a direct outgrowth of the separate spheres ideology that both confined women to the home but also gave women power in the home. The 19th century reform movements like temperance and abolition were part of the story of the emerging middle-class identity in the industrial North. You've probably heard of these social movements in your textbook, if not elsewhere, so I'm going to talk about them only briefly, and in the context of this emerging cultural division between North and South. Temperance was, of course, the movement to stop people from drinking. Remember how much people drank in the colonial period, gallons of whiskey, and it is characteristic of an industrializing society that people cut back on drinking, just as they make their families smaller. Here you can see an expression of the temperance movement's ideology. Here on the right, you've got a man going into a bar, while his wife, clutching their children, tries to prevent him from drinking away his whole paycheck. There's a street light, so you can tell that this is happening at night, when a man should be at home, according to the cult of domesticity, enjoying the home and household his wife makes for him. Here you can see him in the middle, signing the pledge, promising not to drink any more. His children are so grateful. And here on the left, the happy husband, surrounded by his family, in a parlor, with pictures. Very middle class. By these standards, alcohol was a demon, and the movement against alcohol was a woman's holy war in the name of God and humanity. All these women are taking axes to these kegs of whiskey, brandy, and wine. And here, a broadside advertising an 1849 celebration of a temperance group serving tea and coffee. But you can see that the organizers are women, daughters. Even the band has female signifiers. Here, women might speak for the cause in public or be organizers of public events, all to make the world more like the home, a comfort and a clean middle-class place. Abolitionism, too, was becoming a crucial part of middle-class identity in the North as pro-slavery ideology emerged in the South. This medal is part of the worldwide abolition movement, which showed a man in chains praying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" The British had gradually abolished slavery in their colonies, first the slave trade in 1807, then the institution of slavery itself. All the law about owning humans as property in 1833. And immediately they became quite self-righteous about slavery anywhere else it existed, even in the cotton fields that supplied their Industrial Revolution factories. American abolitionists were partly inspired by the arguments the British made, and abolition in one form or another was an important part of middle-class Northern identity. This does not mean that abolitionists were necessarily good people who believed in the equality of black and white Americans. It doesn't mean that they considered African Americans as full Americans. There was a wide range of possible opinion and motivations among American abolitionists. Some of them just thought the whole institution was rot, but that Africans could never become full Americans. These people might support colonization, which was a movement to repatriate all the slaves back to Africa. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1817, created a country on the coast of Africa called Liberia and started sending African Americans there in 1821. These people wanted to be rid of the institution, but also rid of its victims, get rid of slavery and the slaves. Plenty of abolitionists felt the same way. At the more extreme end of the American abolitionist movement was William Lloyd Garrison, who published an abolitionist newspaper starting in 1831. He called for the immediate abolition of slavery across the United States, and this was a very extreme position. Here's the masthead of his newspaper, and you can see the popular tropes about slavery that he's using and that motivated his movement and was part of the popular culture of the time. Here in the middle is Christ and praying to him, a slave in chains, a mirror of the medal we saw earlier. Am I not a man and a brother? Here on the left, you see a slave sail under the flag of the United States, and on the right, children being separated from their mother for sail down the river into the new plantations of the West. The articles in the newspaper covered similar themes and emphasized the enslaved families, as this was part of the cult of domesticity and spoke directly to the people who kept and maintained the 19th century middle-class home, teaching virtue and manners to the children. Abolition spoke directly to the women, and they were extremely active in the national movement. But abolition was also a local issue. Remember that the capital of the United States had been moved from Philadelphia into the South, where slave sales took place in every major city along the path of cotton and westward expansion. The slave trade was not really different from other trades. Here you can see that it's just one of the shops available in one of the few towns of the expanding South. And in the broiling summer of Washington, D.C., the chants of the slave auctions would rise through the open windows, and even Massachusetts abolitionists had to listen. The disgust generated by the practices of the slave trade was very real. But it was also political, as matters of identity often are. And the Democratic Party, founded around the presidential candidacy of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, was becoming more closely associated with Southern planters. Here you can see two images conveying popular tropes about slavery. Here's a young woman being sold to the leering men who could do anything they wished once they had bought her. Her head is down. This shows how modest she is. The sexual abuse of female slaves was an open secret among planters. Everybody knew that some of the slaves were usually the children of the master, and the helpless condition of females in these transactions were some of the most powerful ideological weapons the abolitionists had available. Here on the right is a slave being whipped. And the ribbon that captions these two images associates together a host of political and social elements. The aim and object of the Democratic Party is to preserve the federal union and the rights of the states unimpaired. The Democratic Party stood for small government and against the Federalists, termed Whigs, who wanted government support for internal improvements and economic growth. And here we begin to see the stress on the federal union brought by the rights of the states, which are clearly associated with one right, the power over slaves offered by the southern states, the right to own a woman, the right to whip a man. These were people who knew what states' rights really referred to. And it was this viewpoint that the pro-slavery ideology helped to answer. It said that slavery was a benevolent institution, and working for wages was worse because it made workers dependent without the benefits of paternal care. I think of abolition in the antebellum US a little bit like climate change today. What you believe about it has more to do with your political identity than your actual understanding of the science behind the claims. On either side of the political divide, Democrats believe in climate change, Republicans don't. Abolition was beginning to be the same way, but for social identity. There were still plenty of planters who were Whigs, who wanted canals and roads and the help of the government in supporting economic growth. But more on that when we talk about politics and the second party system. because abolition was an important part of middle-class identity in the industrializing North. There were even children's books and magazines spreading the word. And as the decades wore on, both abolitionists and pro-slavery ideologists became more and more extreme. Here, you can see the abolitionists are outraged, while the books of George Fitzhugh in the 1850s demonstrate exactly what kind of line a Southerner would state when meeting an abolitionist from up north at a resort, or when taking a bit of vacation to do a bit of shopping in New York City, for example. The abolitionists called forth a response, a positive defense of slavery, and Americans began to hold identities that were regionally specific. Just as the economy of the North and the South had diverged over the course of the 19th century, so too did the cultures and ideologies held by the two regions. And they operated from entirely different understandings of the world, and they could less and less speak to each other across that divide. It was extreme, and in the 1850s would make the politics of these sectional identities stress the Union. That's where I'll pick it up next time.